Welcome to the second episode in the series Tumbando El Sistema, One Talk at a Time. My name is Vienna Almonte, class of 2020 and founding president of Tumbao, and I'll be your host for this session. At this time, I would like to introduce each panelist. If the panelists can give like a little wave, just signaling or just so people know who you are. So I'd like to start with Ray Campbell, class of 2023, Yami Jaques, class of 2022, Geraldine, class of 2022, and then Jessica Flores, class of 2020, Jamie Gazai, class of 2021, Will Constant, class of 2021, Bella Madrigal, class of 20, Travis Barnes, class of 2020, and then Avery Covington, class of 20 from Rowan University. This session will feature a discussion centered around the Afro-Latinx community in specific, with questions based on what Latinidad or being Latinx means, the term identifier Afro-Latinx, who can use it, and more. Before diving into any content, if there are any moments in which the audience members agree with something the panelists said, have a question, disagree, you can use your chat icon to insert that. If you have a question or if the audience has a question, there's a Q&A section, which we will have towards the end. So on this week's Instagram, Tumbao's Instagram and LTA's Instagram, there were a few questions posted, including whether or not Afro-descendant and Afro-Latinx are interchangeable, whether phenotype matters when even identifying as Afro-Latinx, and more. Some of the questions like these will be answered in our discussion. And although there is no direct answer to some of these, we'd like to have conversation through these series in order to create an opportunity for discussion and examination of the social issues that the Latinx community faces through self-reflection and the exchange of varied perspectives, with the goal of creating a more united and understanding community. Before we get into any questions, there are some terms that we would like to define. The first term is race. Race in the 21st century refers to the physical differences that groups and cultures consider socially significant, while ethnicity refers to shared culture, such as language, ancestry, practices, and beliefs. Nationality is the state of being part of a nation, whether by birth or naturalization, or ties to a specific nation. We should also distinguish Latinx and Hispanic. These terms are not the same thing. The word Hispanic in English refers to people from Spanish-speaking countries, including Spain and the Caribbean. The word Latinx refers to someone from Latin America or of Latin American descent. This means that someone who is Brazilian is Latinx, but is not Hispanic. Now that we have clarified some of the terms, I'd like to get into our first question. Our first question is, what does being Latinx mean, / what is Latinidad, and is that an accurate term?
So for me, Latinx, I think for a while, and even now, it's still a definition that's like a work in progress. I don't think there's ever going to be a time when there's a set definition for myself, and I think a lot of individuals feel the same. The way I would define it right now, it would be, like that sense of unity or, pride when I find out that someone else is also Latinx. I would also define it as the culture, specifically like for me, I'm Mexican. So a lot of that culture is specifically like the Mexican culture. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the second part to the question?
What is Latinidad, and is that an accurate term?
So I feel like Latinidad isn't an accurate term. I feel like it really depends person to person, but the way I look at it, for example, this past winter, I traveled to Costa Rica, and I realized that a lot of people in Latin America don't even use the word like Latinx, like it's something very new. And when I talked about it with my parents, they were like, yeah, like usually people from Latin America, they don't say, yeah, like, oh, I'm Latino or I'm Latina or I'm Latinx. Like they say, I'm from Mexico, I'm from Central America, I'm from, so on and so forth. So I feel like in the United States, it's a bit more accurate in the sense that it kind of brings a collective group of experiences and cultures. But I feel like outside of the United States, it isn't as accurate because, like when you really look at the grand scope of all the cultures and all the identities that Latinidad is supposed to represent, it's very misleading. Like it's very, very different across Latin America. Like Mexico is very, very different from like Costa Rica. So in those sense, like I feel like it is definitely misleading, but I feel like within the United States, it's a bit more accurate because when Latinos and Latinas or Latinx come here, because we were grouped together, our experience are often very similar and very grouped together.
Geraldine touched like a lot on the important points of Latinidad. Is true. It's not something that is used in like Latin America. Like it's definitely a United States term, and it actually was made here to kind of group them. And grouping them it could be problematic because not all like Latinos come in all shades, so not all of them experience the same type of like identity here. So I feel like it leans more on like whiteness and creates like even like a white supremacist tone, like when you say Latinidad. But that's just on like my part.
Mm-hmm. And as Yami shared, right, she just said right now, being someone who is of Latinx background does not have just one look. People who are Latinx come in different shades, sizes, et cetera, et cetera. So that leads me to my next question. Is it possible to be white and Latinx? So taking race versus ethnicity. If so, what does a white person look like? And is there a way to distinguish someone who is white from North America versus someone who is white from Latin America?
I like to say that yes, it is possible to be white and Latinx. Like, say for instance, people from Argentina or Uruguay, their population is like 95% European. So to distinguish it, I feel like in America, when people from Latin America come and they're fully European, they're white, they're automatically grouped as people of color. But in reality, like they're just as white as a white American, like what you would think of like a Karen or whatever. So I feel like that's definitely problematic.
No, like I totally agree. I feel like we've been socialized to see ethnicity as part of our race, but it is not always quite the same. Because sometimes like we're discriminated based on like what our name is. So like they might see a name that's Hispanic and be like, oh, they visualize someone. They have a specific view of what a Hispanic or Latinx person looks like, but it's just not true. We all look different. And I think it's interesting how like your name can put you in position, but what you look like comes with certain privileges based on what you do look like. So like when you're walking down the street, just because you're Latinx doesn't mean that you're going to be discriminated the same way as somebody else who doesn't look white. So yeah, but yeah, I agree with that.
I was going to say that I think it is important to recognize that there are different races within the Latinx umbrella, being white or black or mixed. But I think in society, we've created it to be what we would call a racialized ethnicity, where we've taken the title of Hispanic or Latino and made that into a race. And unfortunately, that causes erasure for people who are black or who are mixed or white. Yeah.
Just before we move on, I'd like to also ask the question from the panelists. Do you guys think that people who are white Latinx, are they considered white in the US or just Latinx? Or does that depend on something else?
I feel like it depends on who they're around. If we're just going by like the societal view, it's based on who they're around. And it's based on how, like, sometimes where they grew up, because like if you have an accent, people automatically see you as more of someone who's ethnic rather than someone who's white. And it's an American view of the
As Jamie was saying, sometimes when you have a certain group or a certain idea of what someone looks like, or even like white Latinx people, that can cause erasure for other groups. And I'd like to get into the term Afro-Latinx. What does that term mean to you guys?
I think when I hear the word Afro-Latinx, I think of it as Afro recognizing that my or your race is Black, and then your ethnicity is Latinx versus something like Afro-descendant, which to me is recognizing that I may have aspects of African culture, or I may have percentages of me that come from Africa or can trace back to Black people, but I myself am not Black.
Mm-hmm.
You perfectly took what I was going to say. I think it's recognizing your African roots. I think it's a new phenomenon. I think that we're seeing right now is a lot of people are starting to realize and starting to claim their roots, I think it's a good thing personally.
And just based on that, one of our polls asks, are Afro-Latinx, does Afro-Latinx mean that you are Black? 88% of our poll takers said that it does mean that you are Black, while 12% no. To our panelists, are being Black and Afro-Latinx the same?
I don't think they're the same, but Black is kind of an umbrella term for the entire diaspora. Like if you have if majority of your race is from the African continent. So I do believe that Afro-Latinx people are Black, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Black people are Afro-Latinx. Like they're not the same thing.
And I guess I wanted to speak on that as well, because being in a situation of having a African-American dad and a Mexican mother, I didn't necessarily even see my Mexican heritage rooted in African culture. It was more so I wouldn't consider myself in that umbrella of Afro-Latinx, more so just being I don't know, that weird situation of being Black and having those roots, but then not having the same Afro-Latinx roots.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I'm Dominican, and it's I always say the word Afro-Latino because it honestly depends, because Dominicans come in all shades. And honestly, sometimes it's based on who's around me, what they see me as. So honestly, just to be safe, I always just say Afro-Latina because to the world, I am whatever they want me to be half the time. So.
Yeah, going off of that, I'm Haitian, and part Dominican, but growing up, I've always just been Haitian, you feel me, Saint-Pasé, Azo, everywhere. And then coming to Lehigh, I started I was in Tumbao, and I started seeing that you can be, I guess for me, always growing up, I always felt like being Haitian, you couldn't be a part of that. And I don't know, there's a lot of history behind that, but I guess being through Tumbao, I started realizing there's more complexities to that as well. So I agree with that. You also start seeing, when you're around people, you start seeing, how your culture can be viewed differently as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think earlier on, it was the point of, Afro-Latinx versus being Afro-descendant is, according to Jamie, two different things. So I wanted to get the panel's take on it. That was also one of our polls. One of the questions on our poll, 81% of takers believe the term is not interchangeable, so Afro-Latinx and Afro-descendant, while 19% believe they are. Are these terms interchangeable? If so, why? And if not, why not?
I don't think they are, just because I feel Afro-Latinx does take in part that region, the Latin American region, and then Afro-descendant, you could be from Europe and be an Afro-descendant, if you have those roots. So that's more broad. Afro-Latinx definitely is more for the region, if that makes sense.
So I want to get into this idea of acknowledging versus identifying. What does it mean to acknowledge that you are Black versus identify as you're Black? So you have Black roots, acknowledging your African ancestry, your Black roots versus identifying as Black.
I'm gonna start this off. I think it's very clear when you identify as Black, or for me, when I see it, it's truth. It's when you're acknowledging, you be I'm I think I'm Black, or when you identify, you claiming it, and you're there when I've noticed that it'd be some people that be yo, I'm Afro-Latino, I'm Black too, you feel me? And then when it gets serious, or when the heat start, people nah, chill, I'm Hispanic, you feel me, or something like that. That's just my perspective. But I feel when you identify, you can't take it back, you feel me? You claiming it, and it's a part of you now. And that's a serious point that I think a lot of people need to decide too.
I think this term Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latina, with Afro-descendant, these terms are ever evolving, and we're coming into a place of more understanding of what they exactly mean. And as a Black American, I have seen it just as Will has stated, where the option to code switch is ever present. So like the whole identifying piece where you can identify as Black only until you have to endure the suffering that goes along with that Blackness. And I think that is, for me, because I know in, being in proximity with Latinx people, I do recognize that there is a double fold anti-Blackness that works within the culture. And I guess the first anti-Blackness is just race, and the second anti-Blackness is Black American. That there is a anti-Black Americanness throughout the culture that's, underlying with white imperialism, white supremacy, all that good stuff, that whole depiction. But I definitely agree that for me, just as a Black American, it can be very confusing because there is the option to opt out of your Blackness, which many Black Americans don't have that option.
Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to be Black, right? This identify, right? What does it mean to be Black? What is Blackness?
I'm not Black and I don't identify as Black, but the way that, from a Mexican American point of view, the way I've always processed Blackness is more I definitely agree with everything that was said. I do think there's a huge difference between acknowledging your Blackness and identify as Blackness, because I feel like Blackness is identify as a Black person is more so the way you navigate life, and acknowledging it, you can still navigate life like a white person or like a Latinx person and still have Black roots, but that doesn't mean you navigate life like a Black person, especially not as a Black American. So yeah, that was kind of my take on it and how I've processed it.
Yeah, I like to piggyback on that. I feel like Blackness is how you're seen to other people. So when you look at me for the first time, I'm clearly Black. You wouldn't know that. Oh, I have Brazilian roots, I have Latinx roots, but I'm clearly a Black person. And I feel like a lot of times people are like, oh yeah, my grandma's cousin, sister, whatever is Black, so I can say the N word and stuff like that. So that's a really big issue of acknowledging versus accepting it.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ray. I feel like for many of us, it doesn't pass to just have a descendant from your grandmom's cousin's uncle's sister who's Black for you to, take the amenities of Blackness, if we can even call them amenities, and use them to your personal quote unquote advantage. I think Blackness in this discussion, and I don't think I could ever fully express the full definition of what it is to be quote unquote Black. I feel like we would never have enough time, right? But one of the things I can definitely say is that Blackness also has it has to add a phenotypical definition to it. I say this all the time, optics do matter when you are referring to Blackness. And for me, that's a big thing. I know, just real quick, for me, I was listening to a conversation earlier regarding Cardi B, and is Cardi B a Black woman? And at first I'm like, of course not, as a Black American, because you phenotypically see that this is a Latinx woman, but further understanding that she identifies as an Afro-Latina. And that's where the gray area comes in, and the idea of what I just said before about code switching and things of that nature.
I feel like I agree with that. There's, for example, I tend to, based on who I'm around, I fall into a gray area, because on first sight, some people see me as mixed, some people see me as Black, some people see me as, I don't know, it always changes. Some people say I'm ethnically ambiguous. I don't even know, which I just always think it's funny. So going back to what we were talking about identifying versus, what was it again?
Identifying.
The word identifying versus acknowledging. Acknowledging. So going back to that, I feel comfortable acknowledging, because identifying, I feel gets rid of the privilege that I have associated with part of me that's Spanish, but I don't know, I feel like sometimes people don't want you to identify if you're not 100% Black, because I've gotten it from both sides. So what is the right way to go about it? Because you guys earlier were talking about it's better to identify versus just acknowledge. Where is that line in that gray area with people specifically who are like Cardi B or Dominican or look like me.
I
I
mean,
have a question to what Jessica said. You said 100% Black. What does 100% Black mean?
I don't know, but like that's what I faced. Where like that's why I've been asked the question, "Do you identify as Black?" And like, because you're Dominican, and they're like, "Why or why not?" And honestly, it's just based on my experience. Sometimes I'm told, "Yeah, you're Black. I don't know why you don't," or the other times I'm told, "No, you're not Black. Why would you ever like say that? You're definitely Afro-Latina." So I think when I think about race, I'm always confused because quite frankly, I just don't know what box I should go into because like when I click on the census, I put Black and I put Afro-Latina because like I see that as the mix of it. But I'm like, what? It's weird because Dominican is an ethnicity. It's not a race. And like they talk about mulattoes and all that, but like mulatto, like the strict definition is like one white parent and one Black parent. But like the common, like Dominican has been so mixed and so far back that it's like what really is our race.
I feel like too, unfortunately in society, there's been like almost a spectrum of Blackness that's measured on your otherness from being, I guess, stereotypically white, whether that be the way you speak, the color of your skin, the texture of your hair, your socioeconomic status, and where you live. And all of those things add to society's perception of you, of being Black. And unfortunately, I feel like although I identify as mixed, I need to know what I present to society. I would never be able to claim Blackness, nor would I want to, because I feel like that is erasing the experiences of people who are unambiguously and undeniably Black. So, yeah.
I guess I had a quick question for Jessica. Like when they say, like, why would you say you're Black? Like Afro-Latino or Afro-Latinx, like what is your reasoning behind that, do you feel?
I mean, I say I'm Afro-Latina because it's a combination of everything. So like Dominicans they're of African descent, they're of Native descent because we have Tainos, and then they're of Spanish descent. So quite frankly, like I couldn't tell you what percent of what I am. For all I know, I could be 50% Spanish, but I look more phenotypically of African descent. So, like, honestly, I couldn't tell you. So, just in order to make sure that I'm acknowledging all parts of me, I say I'm Afro-Latina because I do not want to take away from somebody's experiences as a person who is Black because I acknowledge the fact of, like, when they see my last name, they see Flores. When they see me in person, it might be different, but, like, they see Flores. So in their mind, when I go in for an interview, they see the Hispanic part of me. So it's like, that's why I say I'm Afro-Latina because I don't want to take away from anybody's experiences, even though some of mine are very similar.
Based on that, I had another question. What does it mean? I know Jessica was talking about this, about being phenotypically Black. What does a Black person look like? Because I feel like we're kind of skating around this whole idea of Blackness and Afro-Latinidad, and you have to look like this. So what does a Black person look like?
I think my brother Avery is well equipped to answer this question.
I don't know about well equipped. I'll say this: when I speak of phenotypic, a phenotype regarding Blackness, I'm specifically referring to skin color, which I know can be dangerous at a certain point, because then you have to ask yourself, how far does it get? Like, how light is too light, or things of that nature. But I know for a fact that there are Black Arabs, right? There are Black Middle Easterners, right? And they're not necessarily from America, but yet their skin color is undeniably, they're unambiguously Black, you know what I'm saying, due to their skin complexion. And so when I'm speaking of phenotype, that is specifically what I'm referring to. Any other thing I think is a dangerous racial trope. If we get into like whether, your lips are this big or your nose is whatever, I think that's a dangerous slope that will actually cause us to revert back to what slave masters imposed upon us. And so that's just where I'm at.
Any other thoughts on what Black looks like, or how does Blackness present itself?
You just say Black is beautiful, and that's it.
I
Uh,
agree, and I'm sorry, sis. I also want to just add to there is a sense of trendiness right now when it comes to the Black experience. That there are people that would love to attribute themselves to Black because it's vogue right now, right? Like Black is in, and we watched Black Panther, so now I want to be like Wakanda forever. And I think the danger with that, again, it lessens the value of the Black experience in America, and it reduces it to like cultural norms. Like it reduces it to if I know lyrics of a song, but there's a history behind the oppression that I think is not felt. So that's all I want to say to that.
Hopping on that. Wait, one thing. Hopping on that, I feel like it's dangerous too. It's like the N word is just like with the culture wise. Like I've noticed that
Preach, brother.
a lot of Hispanic rappers, they just using the N word like it's valid for them, and it's like why y'all doing this? Like, you want more views? You want the Black people to watch y'all stuff, or like why y'all just hopping on that? And I think that is dangerous. Like it's trendy, but like why? Like why? Like why do y'all find it trendy? Like that's my thing too.
With that too, like I'm from Philly, so like here, like growing up, like people Latin, like very light skinned people used to say the N word, and they attribute it to like being from the hood. So like if you're from the hood, you can say the N word, which is really problematic because then you're associating that hoodman, like you have to be you're Black if you're from the hood type thing, which is really bad, and it's something that you see it in mainstream media. Like people love the Black culture, but then they don't when it comes to like things like I don't know, like hair even, braids, like white women using braids, they're really appropriating it. They're not, they're white, so they're not gonna have the oppression that Black women do face because of their hair and like wear like braids in professional setting. So like it's not a trend, it shouldn't be, and that's something that we have to keep working on.
Yeah, to answer Will's question, I mean, I don't have like I definitely agree with everything Yami said. Like it's so normalized. Like if you are like part of the hood, then you can say the N word, and like that's so true. Like I remember, at least like for me personally, like where I grew up, I come from Houston, which is like a majority city, and so like all the neighborhoods that I grew up in, they're like basically all Hispanics. Like there was maybe like one or two kids that were white, one or two kids that were Black. And I think part of the problem, or like, especially for like Latinx and Hispanics, is that there's nobody ever there to tell you that it's wrong. You know what I mean? Like, and like, that's not to say that like, oh, it's okay or whatever, but like as a child, if like you do something and nobody tells you like, this is wrong and this and that, and like they don't necessarily withhold the history of the N-word, but they don't necessarily like also present it to you, then you're in a lot of ways like you're perpetuating the idea that it's okay. Like for me personally, like I have always like admitted to this, like I said the N-word probably up until like I was a sophomore in high school, and not even like early sophomore high school, like late, like probably like going into junior year. And what kind of, I guess, shifted that was that one day one of my friends, and it wasn't even like one of my Black friends, it was she's like from Chicago, she's Mexican. We were in her car and we were singing along to a song, and the N-word came on, and of course like I was used to my whole life singing along, so I was like, I said it, and she just looked at me like so puzzled, and she was like, what's wrong with you? And I was just like, what are you talking about? And she was like, you can't say that. And I was like, what? Say what? Like I didn't say the curse word. I thought she was referring to like the F word or something. She was like, no, the other word. And she eventually told me it's the N word, and I was like, why not? Like it means buddy, like it means friend, like I don't know what you're talking about. And she was like, no, it doesn't. And so she told me like what it meant, and I was so like taken back that I remember like right after she told me, I was like, are you sure? Like, are you sure that it doesn't mean friend or buddy? And I remember I also talked to some of the Black girls in my school, and I was like, like how come, like did you guys know this? Like am I the only one that didn't know this? Like what's going on? And even they told me, they were like, yeah, like, it's, well, I mean, it kind of makes sense, I guess, for them to not have also known that while it is a derogatory term, like, they, like, I remember one of them told me, like, I didn't even know that non-Black people weren't supposed to use it for a long time. And that just, like, blew my mind, because it's just, like, it's, in so many ways, is such a huge form of white supremacy that even Black people go such a long time without knowing that their friends that are non-Black aren't supposed to say it. And, you know, going back to what Yami said, you know, it's just so normalized that, oh, if that, even if you're not Black, it doesn't matter. You know, like, you grew up in the hood, you grew up with, like, quote unquote, what Black people grow up with. And so therefore, by default, you're allowed to say it. And that is, like, so normalized within the, like, Latinx and Hispanic culture. And, you know, going back to Will's point, like, why do you say it? Why this? Why that? I feel like when you reach a certain age where you know it's wrong, but again, it's that entitlement that, you know, you kind of were normalized with your entire life. And I feel like that just goes back to, like, what I was saying about white supremacy. Like, that is a form of white supremacy. The fact that, you know, as kids, they can teach us not to say the F word, they can teach us not to say this, but for some reason, it's so hard to tell kids, don't say the N word. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. And so, you know, coming from a predominantly Latinx community, from a predominantly Latinx city, it's just to the point where, like, people feel so entitled to it, and that once they grow up and once somebody tells them, like, stop, like, you can't say that, it's like, well, why not? Like, I'm entitled to this. I grew up saying this, and, you know, it's been normalized in my community, and, like, the Black people in my community never said anything. And, you know, I don't want to say, like, at that point it's too late, but at that point it takes so much more work to unnormalize it. You know, like, I always say, like, oh, I was lucky that somebody told me my sophomore year of high school, but it shouldn't be about luck. Like, people should know, like, just the way they tell us not to say the F word, like, they should tell us not to say the N word at such a young age too, but they don't. Sorry, that was a little long.
Yeah, I actually have a question in response to something you said. You said, like, some people are not taught not to use the N-word, and with so many resources that we have around and so many opportunities to educate ourselves, especially in the new century that we live in, that looks very different. It almost seems as if we're excusing people that should not be using the N-word and allowing them to use it because they weren't taught this or they didn't know any better. So with so many resources, like I said, should we excuse people?
I don't think that we should excuse people. I think you still have to hold people accountable. But I also think and I think that's the hard part for me, like, where's the line between, like, it's a legitimate reason and it's like, now you're making excuses for yourselves. And, you know, like, the way I think about it, like, oh, but, you know, like, you grew up in the time of technology where, like, knowledge is so accessible. And while that is, like, that's definitely true, I also, like, and this is just my experience, like, I also wasn't a kid, like, looking up, like, oh, like, what does the N-word mean, if that makes sense, or, you know, and because it was so normalized in, like, my specific community and my vocabulary, and because, you know, I genuinely thought, you know, it meant friend, it meant buddy, and, you know, like, nobody ever told me anything, or, you know, like, the Black students that went to my school, nobody ever said anything. It never made me question whether it was a good or bad word, because, you know, you kind of grow up, like, thinking, oh, if it's bad, like, somebody's going to tell me something, but then they don't. But kind of going back to your question, I feel like at now, I feel like it kind of goes, like, to individual case. Like, I feel like once you're presented that information, and especially now that, you know, we're talking about Black history so much, it's like, where have you been that you haven't heard it type of thing. Like you can't not say that you didn't know, because especially right now, like, it's all over social media. Like, you no longer have to go and, like, search up what does the N-word mean. Like, it's literally being put everywhere on social media, like Black history and what Black people go through. Like, it's not no longer about like, oh, you yourself go out and look for that information. Like, it's being presented to you. I'm not really sure if that answered the question, but that was just kind of like my individual experience with it.
I feel like there's just no excuse to say it. You feel me? Like I've had, like, I'm from Jersey. There's a lot of people in Jersey that think they can say it because they're from the hood. And I honestly think, like, no matter where you're from, you just can't say it, like, if you're not Black. In my opinion, that's just my perspective. Because, like, when you look at it, so I think during the protests, Dominicans was trending on Twitter. I don't know if y'all saw this. And I was like, yo, like, why are they trending on Twitter? And in Dykeman, and I don't know about New York. I don't really fuck with New York, so I don't know much about it. But in New York, Dominicans was chasing Black people out and just tweaking. And New York, like, everybody says the N-word, like, in New York. They claim it. It's like a part of the hood. It's part of the culture. It means buddy. But, like, how y'all chasing Black people out of your area, accusing them of this, that, and the third, and then y'all gonna say it, like, 5 days later or 2 days later? So in my opinion, like, just the way, like, there's some white people that know they're not supposed to say it because they know they're gonna get, beat up or whatever. I feel like there's just, in my opinion, just no excuse to say it. In my opinion.
If I would like to add on to what Will is saying, and I think what Will and Geraldine are hitting at is this underlying relationship that Latinx communities have with Black Americans, and this still ties into the Afro-Latina conversation, because I do believe that in the Afro-Latinx movement, there also has to be juxtapositioning some form of movement that says we are not going to allow any further anti-Blackness in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our cookouts. Like, I know that my tío and tía cook great arroz con gandules, but come on, I love some arroz con gandules too, but I will not allow them the space any longer to tote and retort anti-Black sentiments any longer. And like I said, there's two forms of anti-Blackness in the, and again, it's in it for Black Americans too, in our community as well. We have a colorism issue as well, of course, Black Americans, light skin versus dark skin, that whole thing going all the way back to the plantation. But from what I've seen as an outsider looking in, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, in the Latinx community, the colorism is twofold, as I stated. It's one, your skin, if you're darker, that might be an issue, right? But or if you have any attributes that may relate to being, like, quote unquote Black or whatever they deem it to be. But part two, it's an anti-Black American sentiment. It's like, at least we're not Black Americans. Mm-hmm. I'm Dominican, but at least I'm not a Black American. And any other stereotype that associates that itself with that. And I feel like the Afro-Latinx community really needs to take up these causes as well. And I would just implore all my Latinx brothers and sisters who are listening to take up these causes as well, and not just on a macro level that looks cute on Instagram, but even more so in your home first.
Amen to that.
I just wanted to, like, applaud what you said. Like, I definitely agree, like, take it up in your homes, because I feel like everybody's, like, especially now, it's like, it seems like something woke to do if you call out, like, strangers or your friends to, like, oh, you can't say the N-word, da-da-da-da-da-da. But then you go home and you live with every single person in your household says the N-word and you stay quiet. And it's like, well, oh, it's my family. Oh, like, that's too hard of a battle. Those are the battles that we should be taking on, like, the hardest battles. Like, I definitely agree, like having those conversations about saying the N-word is definitely really, really hard, especially when it comes to your family, because you can't just, it's not like a stranger where you say stop saying the N-word and you never have to see them again or whatever, you don't have to deal with it. But you have to, it's your family, you care about them, and just at some point, like, it does hurt the fact that you see how they've internalized anti-Blackness and how, you're telling them that this is something they can't say because it hurts people, because it has this history, and they seem not to care. And it does hurt, but, like, just, like, you can't stop just because you're uncomfortable, like, now it's like always people choosing to remain comfortable has been, at the cost of other people suffering, at the cost specifically of Black people. And so I definitely agree, like, if you're going to say that you're willing to have these conversations everywhere except your own household, then you're not an ally.
And Avery was talking about the idea of like this division, right, between the Latinx community. So you can still, let's say, acknowledge your African ancestry, or even say you're Afro-Latinx, right? But then you also don't want to be categorized into this black or idea of what a Black American is, right? As he said, sometimes, some people say, at least I'm not this, right? And back to something else he said, I want to tie that into, right, this idea of how Avery said, right, using Blackness, or like how Blackness has become a trend, right? People only acknowledge, right, their Black side or ancestry, or acknowledge that they're Black when it benefits them. So besides the N-word, what are other benefits that being Black affords, or why is being Black a trend? Why do people do this when it's convenient to them?
I think now we're kind of in a space in society when we are recognizing, that there are people who have been marginalized in the US or even around the world, and that there has been a great amount of attention afforded to these causes, rightfully so. And because of that, people, for the most part, I think are picking up the idea of wanting to be Black to say that I have the deepest and hardest struggle, and that I can connect to all of these things, and that, I am at the bottom of the totem pole societally, unfortunately. And I think that that's really dangerous, and that's why it's so important to recognize, the privileges that you were afforded in the skin that you have, or the phenotype that you have, or, the socioeconomic privileges that you have as well.
On the first part of your question, I want to talk about how like Black people are often portrayed like in media throughout other countries, not necessarily Latin America, but I know I have a friend from Nigeria, and he said that he was kind of ashamed to be grouped with Black Americans because in TV over there, in American TV, we're often shown as like the lazy people or the poor people or whatever, and when they come to America, they don't want to be like grouped with that, to be, kind of seem as close, as distant from Blackness as they can in American sense. And on the second instance, I don't really think people claiming Blackness for convenience has to do with oppression. I think it has to do with, the fact that the Black diaspora is like the most influential, like majority of things that are created in the Black diaspora are used everywhere else and used for popularity and trends, stuff like that.
We kind of fleshed out in a way like Blackness, right, whiteness, and the term Afro-Latinx, and acknowledging versus identifying. And I want to get a little bit into physical appearance and optics, right? 80% on our survey said that a person's physical appearance does not matter when identifying as Afro-Latinx, right? I wanted to get into who can use the term Afro-Latinx to describe themselves and who can't. As we know, right, now there's a certain trend, as we were saying, where everyone wants to acknowledge their roots, right? So if everyone from a specific country starts saying, oh, we're all Black, we're all Afro-Latino, does that harm our conception of Blackness?
That is so, it's so dangerous. I'm shocked that 80% of people said that the phenotype doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was going to be like the opposite, because what happens, hypothetically speaking, when the white passing Latinx brother or sister decides one day, because they want to be an ally, to be Black and Afro-Latinx, then the next day they don't. And this is such a gray area, but I feel like to throw away the phenotype altogether, I feel like would be absurd.
Like what I said earlier, like it's based off how society perceives you, because you can be like, oh, I'm from DR or I'm from Puerto Rico, so I'm Black, but that doesn't necessarily like hold true, because it's a difference between your culture being rooted in African roots and you being from like an African descent. So that's like a really big difference.
Like for me, like, yes, I acknowledge that I do have Afro descent in me, but it's like, it would be wrong for me to just claim it because I'll then be like, my experience will be different from somebody. I'm Dominican, so it would be different from like a Dominican that's like dark skin, you know. Like, even though yes, we do have heritage and we do have that, and I'm very proud of it, and I see it in my culture all the time. It will be wrong for me to like use that term, because then I'll be like denying that I have privilege because I am a light skinned Dominican.
I think what Yami just said, like, is perfect. It's this idea that if you don't acknowledge that your lighter skin provides you a privilege and throw that away and just say that I'm Black, or I'm Afro Latinx, it almost diminishes the struggle at this point. It almost diminishes, like, you know, I'm just shocked that 80% of people said it doesn't matter. I'm just still on that. I'm sorry, because that's amazing to me, because I feel like that has to be a part of the discussion. You know, it can't just be something we throw away from this discussion.
So based on that, Avery, where you're saying that phenotype does matter, what does an Afro Latinx person look like then?
Again, again, for me, optics definitely matter. However, I would never go as far as like a list of, like, you know, physical attributes that one who's Afro Latinx has to have. However, I do think skin color does play a part in the discussion of race. At least, I mean, it has to play a part to some degree in how we view who's Black and who's not. You know, I think that just has to be a part of the discussion.
So like you saying, so what would you say to somebody if they like claiming you for me, like they're Afro Latino, but they're not, they're white passing? Like, what are you gonna say to them in that moment?
In that moment, I would not necessarily. It depends on how much I care about them, because if I have little care, I'm not going to rush to tell them and shatter their identity. However, I will say I will provide like the Socratic method. I would give them questions. So what does that mean for you? How are you attributing Afro Latinx characteristics? How is your dad Black? Is your mom Black? How far are we going back in your ancestry to denote that you are not just simply one that has have African descendants versus you actually being an Afro Latinx person? So that's how I would try to, talk through that. But again, I'm not saying, a lot of times people view Black Americans as the gatekeepers of Blackness. And I don't want to give off that sentiment at all. I don't want to feel like I am the gatekeeper of who can be Black and who's not. I also understand that there is a trouble in the Afro Latinx community for Black people. Because for Black people, it's like, oh, you're Black. And then when you say you're Black, they're like, no, you're not. You know what I'm saying? So I understand that there is a struggle there as well. But I just really hope that we don't rush for like, just because you're Puerto Rican, you're Black, when there are white Puerto Ricans, when there are white Dominicans, where there are, just because you're from South Africa doesn't mean you're Black. There are white South Africans. So it's like, this idea is just kind of, it can be very dangerous if we don't tackle it with some sense.
Mm-hmm. So I think that leads me into a thought. I was thinking about the 1-drop rule, right? And how back then it was, if you had 1 drop of African blood in you, then you're Black, right? But according to some of the things I'm getting here is, no, that may not be true today, right? Because as Avery said, if you have to go so far back, so like my great grandmother is Black, but you're white passing, then, maybe you shouldn't identify as Black. So I just wanted to know, is this 1-drop rule still prominent today, or should we not acknowledge it the same way that it was looked at back then?
I'm gonna say that's cap. Like, that 1-drop rule is cap. Like, this is gonna sound like this. Let me give an example. Like, you got a bowl of water, right? You put a drop of soap in it. Is the whole water soapy? Like, you feel me? Like, that's my interpretation. Like, I don't think that little 1-drop rule, that's cap. That's cap. That's gotta go.
And I think people don't also think, like, if we were trying to think about it the reverse way, it would seem insane. Like, Avery has, 2% European probably, right? And if he were to go around saying, I'm white, we would all look at him like he's absolutely crazy. So I feel like we have to think about it in, like, that, again, optics matter, and your percentages also don't really matter. It's like a all-inclusive thing that society looks at you as. And while it's very nuanced, you have to take in all of those nuances when recognizing what you're claiming as an identity.
I think it also goes back to the fact that the one drop rule only really existed to prevent people from having privilege. Like, the only reason why it worked that way was like they didn't want you to own land, they didn't want you to own money, they didn't want you to have anything. So that's really the only reason why it exists. So of course it doesn't stand because it was ridiculously made.
Right. It's an artifact from slavery. And if we begin to view if we begin to go backwards and view people in that same lens, I mean, that would just send us as a people backwards. I'm thinking, for me, the one drop rule was a move of oppression, of course, but I wonder if it's different for Latinx people, given the history of you guys' oppression, which is very different than the oppression that was experienced by American slavery. Because from what I understand, for Latinx communities, there was a way to become white eventually through the bloodline, through, if I keep having sex with these people, that people, eventually you'll be white someday. For Black Americans, we didn't have that option. You were Black and you was Black. You know what I'm saying? And so like the whole one drop rule, I don't think it applies contextually to our discussion today in regards to the 21st century right now.
So based on that, I'd like to get into this idea of biracial or multiracial identities, right? With this idea of mixing between people. Sometimes our definition or what we think of as race is based on this North American definition or breakdown. So I wanted to ask, are biracial or multiracial identities only applicable to people, let's say, from the United States of America, right? Because we're talking about, as Avery mentioned before, there are white Dominicans just like there are white Black Dominicans, et cetera, et cetera. So can the same idea of biracial or multiracial identities be applied to other groups, specifically in the Latinx context?
Are you saying, like, can people from Latinx countries claim to say that they're mixed or multiracial? I mean, I think definitely, like, if I have a white Latinx mother and a Black Latinx father, then I am therefore mixed, and I just so happen to be Latinx, or I just so happen to be Puerto Rican, or whatever mix in between there. I think it's possible for any culture, anyone around the world, to be mixed racially. So.
I like that, Jamie, because like I feel like it's not a term that has been used, like especially like for like, let's say, yeah, you're Dominican, you have a Black Dominican, a white Dominican, like it's not a term that has been used, like so we should start normalizing that, because I feel like it can't, like it should happen. Like, why not? When you think of biracial, you usually think of like a Black person and an Asian person and they have a kid and that's biracial, but like we haven't used that in like our countries, and I feel like that would be like a good start and a good way. We should promote that more, because it makes sense, it will be a easier way, I guess. Because I know, like, for me, when I'm like back then, when I used to like do like like censuses or anything like that, like it would be like white, Black, Asian, and then I'll be confused. I'll be like, wait, but my mom, but my dad. So like I think biracial would be like a great term to like imply later on for like our cultures in Latin America.
So based on that, from what I'm getting, there should be a term that acknowledges these people that are in the middle, right? For some people don't claim, or they don't feel like they can identify as Afro-Latinx, right? But they're also not white Latinx, right? So there's these people in the middle, and I want to segue that into this idea of brown, right? Black and brown people. 85% of people on the poll said that the word brown is not a good racial identifier for people who are Latinx. What are brown people? Is this term oversimplified? Does it leave out certain groups?
I don't know about other areas, but in Texas, for like the longest time, probably since like the 60s, brown was anyone from like the Philippines, South Asia, Latin America, or wherever else. So it's like this all-encompassing thing of numerous different ethnicities, but within the one ethnicity that people are speaking about, such as Latinx, like everyone's not brown, everyone's not mestizo, everyone's not indigenous. We have white, black, Asian, whatever. So that's a very problematic term to use.
Does anybody think brown is a good racial identifier?
I don't think it's necessarily the best racial identifier, but I think for the most part, people use it out of convenience, just kind of to encompass, I guess, non-white ethnic minorities who can have intersecting struggles with Black people or Black Americans. So while it's not the best term, I think it's definitely just a term used out of convenience.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that any term that kind of intends to encompass like the entirety of our community is going to be flawed in one way or another. And I think it's the same for the term brown. I feel like it is definitely a term that's used because it's easier, because people don't really want to go into the specifics of, you know, nationality and race and ethnicity, and it's kind of an overwhelming subject for a lot of people, so they resort to saying, oh yeah, Black and brown, but what does that really mean?
I also wanted to get into another term brought up by Bella that feels all-encompassing, the term people of color, right? What does people of color mean, and who can identify as a person of color? Should it be taken literally, or is it a synonym with the word minority?
You know, one thing that I've been noticing lately is the BIPOC thing that's going around too. It's like, I don't know, I feel like some people be saying they're a person of color, and like, I'm just surprised by the things they be saying sometimes. So personally, I find it very dangerous when we just use this broad stroke thing, like person of color, like what does that mean? Like why? I just find that very problematic too sometimes.
I most definitely agree. Like person of color, most people say is someone who's not considered white, but technically on paper, Middle Easterners are white, but they're people of color. A white person from Argentina or Uruguay, they're white, but they're grouped in the person of color category. So it's most definitely like something that people oftentimes use to kind of say like, oh yes, I'm in a like oppressive group, but I don't really think it has anything to do with color. I think it more has to do with like an ethnic, cultural aspect.
I think any term that's used by a politician, by a state official, by anyone that oversimplifies a group of people will lead to erasure, and that is a problem. And I feel like if they're too lazy to say the actual group, they shouldn't be in any position. That's all I'm saying.
I think for me as a white Latina, I struggle to identify with the term person of color, because I do think that it's been used in this way of like, yeah, you have like a certain otherness to you, but it doesn't necessarily apply to me in my experience, for example. I mean, I know I'm white, and I know that that's afforded me a lot of privileges that people of darker skin tones don't have. So I don't feel right using the term person of color. And I think a lot of people kind of use it because it's easy, the same way that they would use the term brown. But it can definitely be exploited in a way.
I'd like to now get into like our personal stories as panelists. First, I'd like you to share race, ethnicity, nationality, and then does one of your identities take precedence, right? We have talked about nationality, race, like Afro Latinx, white Latinx, whether you're in this gray area where you don't know what you are, what term to use. So if some of the panelists can share their personal identities and whether or not they feel like some of these identities take precedence over the other.
My nationality, I'm American. And my race, I would say I'm multiracial or mixed. And then my ethnicity is Puerto Rican and Persian or Iranian. And I think for me, my ethnicity tends to take precedent over other identities. One, because I am racially ambiguous, and because I am multiracial. That doesn't, there hasn't, I don't really have a cultural connection to my race as much as I would with my ethnicity. And my ethnicity is kind of shaped more my perception of life, or how I present myself to the world, how I grew up, how I talk, all of that. So yeah.
In terms of race, I'll say like multiracial or biracial, ethnicity, nationality, Dominican. And like when people ask me what identity, I usually just say like Dominican, which is ethnicity, and my nationality, but ethnicity, just because, yeah, Jamie, she said it right. Like I just feel more like with race, it's very like, I'm very still like confused on it. And it's easier for me just to say like I'm Dominican, if that makes sense.
I'm a Black American. I come from the people of the diaspora that came here as slaves. I know the plantation in which my forefathers came out of in North Carolina. And in regards to my ethnicity or my nationality, I must say that I regard my ethnicity definitely in a higher regard than my nationality. I think, as a Black American, for Black Americans build America, in many ways. Our blood was shed to build a lot of this place. And so there is definitely a respect there for what my ancestors have built regarding America. But however, America has betrayed Black people too many times for me to put that in a higher regard than my own ethnicity. And so that's why I usually attribute my ethnicity to a greater, higher degree, a loftier degree than that of my American nationality.
What we supposed to say? I'm Black. I'll say that first. I'll say next, I'm Haitian. My mom, she got some like Dominican thing going on over there. But I've always, somebody asked me what I identify, I'll say Black first, because when they see me, they don't really see much. But like my optics, I guess. But I always claim being Haitian. Like it doesn't mean that I'm not Black, but it's just like when you look at Haitian history, it's so strong, it's so deep. Like the first independent Black country. We came to America, helped our brothers that was enslaved over here, helped them out. So like, and we get disrespected a lot. I'm gonna say that. Like people don't know our worth. We get disrespected a lot. I like to think of Haiti as like the Wakanda before Wakanda. You feel me? But yeah, like I claim that as I'm Black. Like somebody asked.
My, I guess, race would be Black, nationality American, and then ethnicity Mexican. If I were to identify as any one of them, it would it usually ends up being Black, because I know that's what the world will just see me as in terms of optics. Like that'll never just go away, and you can never like, at least for myself, I will never deny that, and I accept that fully. Even though in a cultural sense, I've lived with the Mexican side of my family more so. So I never want to exclude the two and say like I choose one or the other. But I know the world will just see me as Black in that sense.
So I'm American, Dominican, and I say for race, I just kind of say Afro-Latina. And I feel like, both my parents are Dominican, so I feel like the Dominican part definitely takes precedent. Like I'm always with my family, and like I feel like culture has a lot to do with how I've been like socialized. But yeah.
I'm white, nationality American, and ethnicity Colombian and Bolivian. I'd say, personally, the way that I look at myself, the marker that kind of weighs the most in my identity is the Hispanic side of me, the Colombian and Bolivian side. But I also acknowledge that when I walk through the world, a lot of people might not see that, and so the way that I'm perceived by other people could be more heavily white. And of course, I'm afforded a lot of privilege because of that. I also think that our generation has kind of formed this like hybrid Hispanic American culture that takes a lot of, our language and culture from our, parents, but also mixes it with this kind of Americanized upbringing. So I think that's also like an important thing to note, that there are a lot of, like, if you've heard the term, like, Enye people, that are kind of a little bit of both.
So for me, my race is Black, ethnicity, African American and Brazilian. And I feel like my Latinx heritage probably is the most repressed out of all of them, because I I suffered from like a twofold issue. One was being Brazilian and considered Latinx. Like most people wouldn't think of that as Latinx because we don't speak Spanish. The language is Portuguese. So when I was younger and I would speak Portuguese, like people would say like, oh, you're not considered Latinx because you don't speak Spanish, like you're not from a Spanish speaking country. So that was an issue. And also like because of my skin color, I grew up in Texas where the majority of the Latinx population is Mexican, and there's only like 1% of the Mexican population is Black. So they have never seen an Afro Latinx person in their life. So it's like this issue of like trying to prove to everyone like, yes, I am Afro Latinx, but I'm not Hispanic, and all this other issues with skin color and race.
I'm Mexican American, but for race, I don't know. I feel like I've even like now I still have trouble like really like, like I don't identify as white and I'm not Black. So it's just kind of been like like this like fighting conflict with myself. And, like growing up, I would just check like the white box because I was like, oh, like I guess that's it, right? But I definitely identify more with like my Mexican culture. Like that's, like how I live my life, the culture I'm most closely associated with. So yeah, like for me, like when people ask like, oh, like what are you? I'm just like Mexican.
Before we end, there was a question that someone had from the audience. If anyone, just a few panelists want to take it. The question is, can Blackness be defined outside of the oppression that Black people have faced?
I don't want to misinterpret the question because I might be reading too deep into the question. Because when I read it, it says, can Blackness be defined outside of the oppression that Black people face? Is he talking about Black Americans, Black Puerto Ricans, Black, like, is he talking about Black people is he or she talking about Black people as a whole? I would say, given that I don't know, I would say that, of course, I think, Blackness can be defined. I don't know if necessarily outside. I think there's more than just the oppression that we face. I think the oppression is a part of the definition. Being in regards to Black Americans, I know being resilient against oppression is a part of the definition of our heritage and of our Blackness. And so I don't know if he's specifically referring to one group of Black people, but I can only speak as of right now, he or she, I can only speak of as of right now for where I am as a Black American.
I think you said it perfectly. Like I feel like there's more to it than oppression. No one's saying that if you're not oppressed, you're not Black. But I think like, and even when we say Black, like there's so much to more than just being Black. Like you seen what happened when the president of our school said Black people and or African American. I'm sorry, but like there's just so much going on there. But I definitely do believe that it's more than just being oppressed. It just comes with it, but it's not the only thing that's a part of it.
Right, and for many Black people, and not just Black Americans, Black people all over the world, for many of them, they have experienced some form of oppression, and yet and still they have overcome. And I do think that yet and still they have overcome is necessary in regards to the culture. And you see it in their art, you see it in their song, you see it in their dance, you see it, all throughout even their language at some point, that this idea of overcoming is a part of our culture. And that's a beautiful thing. Black is so beautiful, y'all.
And someone just asked another question. The question was, how can someone from a very privileged Hispanic background get in touch with their heritage when their life experience is so different?
Do they mean like privilege as in like their skin tone, or privilege as in like wealth?
Both.
They said both.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like I think like the part that kind of like makes me, I don't know, like makes me feel conflicted is like get in touch. Like I feel like whether you're like light skin or whether you're wealthy or whatever, like you can still be, you can still identify with the Hispanic / like Latinx culture. Like I feel like I feel like when people say like, oh, like even though like I'm wealthy or like I'm light skinned, I'm still Latinx, like that, like wealth and being light skinned isn't an exception to Latinx. It's a part of it, if that makes sense. Like Latinx isn't just like brown, like being brown or dark skin or like being poor, like like you can still be wealthy and be a Latinx. But I think that a lot of people, when they do think of Latinx or Hispanics, they do make those presumptions of like, oh, to be a Latinx or to define an experience as a Latinx is to imply like poverty or being like a bit more dark skinned, when it's kind of like what we've been discussing this entire time. Like there's a spectrum of shades and there's a spectrum of experiences, and like wealth isn't an exception to that. Like we should normalize like wealth in like as part of like the Latinx culture. Like any culture, like you can still be wealthy, you don't just have to like be poor.
I was gonna say that if you feel like you gotta discard your, like, I'm not Hispanic, so don't take my advice, but I feel like if you feel like you gotta discard your Hispanic side to feel privileged, then you already lost touch with yourself. Like I feel like I've noticed that too. It's like there's some people who discard being who they truly are to feel privileged, or like they want to be part of the privilege, the oppressor side, so they're not gonna claim that. So I think that's another thing too. Like you have to be authentically you. Like you can't pretend that you're not Hispanic one day and then be like, oh, I'm Hispanic now on Tuesday, Wednesday. Like you always got to be a part of that because that's what you are.
I think conversely to that, while you shouldn't, erase the Hispanic side of yourself, there is also a point where you need to acknowledge the privileges that you do have while being Hispanic and still having, a more privileged skin tone or socioeconomic background. And I think that, in my opinion, how somebody with like a more privileged Hispanic background can get in touch with their heritage is really learning their history and taking an active role in unlearning the things that might have, catered to anti-Blackness in your life that you've never really had to deal with. And making sure that you're constantly in a state of growth and in a state of learning, and not denying the history that has brought you to this point.
I know I can't speak fully to this. However, I can say that exposure is always necessary for growth. And if you feel as though you have lost touch to any degree, whoever this person is, due to your economic status or your social status, I would urge you to expose yourself to a different kind of Hispanic people that's not in your home, that's not readily available to you. Make friends with those who don't necessarily have that much money as you, so that you can understand and educate yourself in that sunlight, in that exposure.
Thanks, Avery, for sharing that last thought. As he was saying at the end, it's important for all of us to expose ourselves to people who might not look like us, and just expose ourselves and learn or unlearn some of the things that have become normalized in our lives. It's time. We have come to an end, and I just want to thank each and every panelist for sharing and joining us today and answering these tough questions. The conversation doesn't stop here. Some of these topics you can spend hours talking about, so it's important for all of us, again, to educate ourselves. This video will be accessible on Tumbao's YouTube channel and also our Instagram, so be on the lookout for that. And this is just episode 2. Tune in next week for the next topic, which will address privilege, disadvantages, and colorism within the Latinx and Black community. Again, I want to thank every audience member who watched today for joining, and our panelists. Thank you all and have a great night.